आज हामीसँग हुनुहुन्छ रिसर्चर डाक्टर अलेक्जेन्ड्रा परेरा। उहाँ चाहिँ पोर्चुगलको पोर्चुगिज सोसियल साइन्सको रिसर्चर हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँले नेपाली कम्युनिटीको बारेमा रिसर्चहरू गर्नुभएको छ, अहिले पनि गर्दै हुनुहुन्छ। अब अगाडिको कुरा चाहिँ हामी डाक्टर अलेक्जेन्ड्रा परेराबाट सुनौँ। नमस्ते।
Namaste. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you introduce your work?
So I will introduce, first my work, and how I came to study the Nepalese community in Lisbon and in Portugal. First of all, I come from another area of studies. I studied clinical psychology in Coimbra University, which is a university in central Portugal. And I got interested also in intercultural psychology. And later on, I had some experiences living as an immigrant in other European countries, in the north of Europe, in the UK and in Finland. So in the UK, I got involved with the Nepalese community, which is very strong there, and they have their own research centers in the UK, trying to bring their rights forward and to demand certain legal rights in the UK. So I worked with several immigrant associations in the UK. Some of my best friends in the UK were Nepalese. So that's how I got interested. I came back to Portugal and I was doing a research project for a PhD in sociology of migrations. And then my supervisor knew of that, my previous experience, and he suggested, why not the Nepalese? Because you're the only person here, nobody studied the Nepalese yet in Portugal. So, and that's how I got involved in 2013, 2014. So it was a 4-year research project. I finished in 2018, and I decided to study the transnational networks that sustain the Nepalese businesses in Portugal, especially in Lisbon. So I interviewed 36 entrepreneurs, Nepalese entrepreneurs in Lisbon, and 34 workers working for them. Nepalese. So we were trying to research how come the Nepalese businesses could flourish in Portugal, especially since 2008 forward, when we were in economic crisis. The Nepalese were coming, opening their businesses, and they could sustain them with very strong transnational networks supporting them. Sometimes families, sometimes friends, sometimes people from the same ethnic group, borrowing money or giving loans or trying to help them to open their own business and get legal in Portugal. So some of our main, later on, I got involved in 2017 in another project with Nepalese, but this time not about the businessmen and their workers, but more about the Nepalese who come directly from Nepal or from other European countries to work in agriculture, especially in the south of Portugal, in agriculture red berry farms. And the human trafficking networks involved with that. So we organized an international conference in Lisbon about that. We made interviews with some dozens of workers in the agriculture sites. And how I got involved with Nepalese, how I got interested in the subject, I told you. And
the one thing your first interaction with the Nepalese community
was not in Portugal, was in UK and Finland also.
Okay. So
when I was myself an immigrant.
Okay. So now we can talk about the Nepalese immigrants people's adaptation process in the Portugal. So how you find the situations in the Portugal?
I think it's still difficult for them. I mean, there is a very good will from Portuguese authorities, but I think many policies should be taken still. for example, language classes is a struggle because the language is very different, the culture is very different. Many people come here and they speak English or they don't speak even English, and it's very difficult to find a job without speaking the Portuguese language still for foreigners.
The one is the
Or
language
at least
barrier.
English.
Language barrier.
Language barrier, the language classes are not available from Portuguese authorities often, or they are too expensive, or the timetables, they coincide with the work hours of the people, so they cannot attend, or they have Portuguese teachers who don't speak English with them and don't speak Nepalese either, so there's a communication problem.
Is there any kinds of the facility if some Nepali wants to learn Portuguese language, if there is something?
In the past there was a Portuguese, there was a Nepalese couple. They used to be teachers of languages and maths in Nepal. They came here and they opened a language institute. But they went to the UK meanwhile, some 1.5 years ago. There was another teacher, also Nepalese, teaching here close from this area, and his family has been living for like 24 years in Portugal, was one of the first families coming here. And he was teaching in his part-time Portuguese language classes, but he's not very available now because he has no support from the Portuguese state, and he has his own businesses to run, restaurants in several areas of Lisbon. So nowadays, mainly this NIALP, the Nepalese Association, is going to start courses soon. And sometimes in Portuguese high schools, at night, they have Portuguese teachers teaching Portuguese to foreigners. But it's not in every school. The very limited applications, the deadlines are also limited, and sometimes they charge too much to people who don't have the resources to pay for the classes. So mainly the Nepalese associations and RNA also are doing this kind of effort to give people classes, not the Portuguese authorities exactly yet.
As I heard in the public, there is something, what is this? There is something, the government is providing language classes in free of course in some of the language schools for the immigrants peoples. How about this?
It's not so easy. Yeah, we have. There are also in Lisbon University. There is a language institute where you can apply to go there. But the vacancies usually they have just 20 students or so, and there are hundreds of people interested in the classes. In some, the information doesn't get to the people, to the immigrants, to the Nepalese, because sometimes they don't spread the information around in the Nepalese associations, where they should go to apply, how much is the cost of the course, and that kind of thing. And also this communication problem with the teachers, that many times the teachers, they are good Portuguese teachers, but they don't talk English very well, and the immigrants don't talk English very well. So it's like a gap, there's a gap. And
that means even one of the Nepalese who they don't have the good English, or even they have a good English, and
the Portuguese teacher might not have.
That will be the
that's the main problem, the main issue. And another issue is the timetables, if they coincide with the work hours of the people or not. Sometimes they are during the day, and if you are working, you are just available at night and tired by the end of the day, so it's not easy. If you have a family, so sometimes it's easier for them to have their own business and go to online courses, to YouTube or other courses, and have their own timetable than to attend that kind of course. But the main problem is also communication, translation of materials from Portuguese to Nepalese. We should have, in the tax office, social security office, these kind of places, they should have. One of the problems is the language, and the culture is very different. Portuguese don't know anything about Nepal. They just know they have this kind of conversation, common sense, like, oh, such a cute country. We know about the earthquakes. It's like a green country in Asia that Portuguese don't know anything about. The culture, nor the ethnic groups, nor the traditions, nor the politics of Nepal, or the civil war, or the monarchy. They don't know anything about. So one thing is the communication, and also our public facilities, the public services don't have translations, flyers with translation for the people, the immigrants to go there and have the right information available. So many times the Nepalese associations do this kind of informal work. They contact people, or they create groups on Facebook or online, and they try to, yes, voluntary work.
So I'm again in the language. So some of the Nepalese are very good at Portuguese language. As your research result, and how they learn the Portuguese language? Do you have some idea?
From my interviewees, like I had, for example, in the south of Portugal, usually they pay their own classes in a private language center. The ones that I could find spoke a better Portuguese, almost as a native, you know. They lived here at least 4, 6, 8 years, and they had their own classes in the private language centers, but they paid for them. Or they had a job where they had to interact with many Portuguese, and they asked their colleagues to help them with the Portuguese daily, so it was easier for them when they don't work with other Nepalese and they have to work with Portuguese. So usually it's informal at the workplace, or they pay private classes.
Have you met some Nepalese speaks like a native level?
Yes, I have.
Language?
Yes, I have. And they had worked in several places, in Lisbon, in Cascais, in Faro, in the south. They have family already here, children born here. The wife came already, so they are very well adapted. And they had even our current oral expressions in Portuguese. They use them, so it's like a native. You would not distinguish. So I had a few cases. I don't know, maybe about 5, 6 that you could not distinguish. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go about the cultural adaptations in the Portugal. What are the difficulties facing Nepalese peoples, the Nepalese community here to settle here?
Family structure here is a bit different from Nepal. Okay, in Portugal, divorces are very common. Like more than maybe 60% of the couples who get married, they get divorced in 5 or 6 years nowadays. And in Nepal, this is not common. So many times my interviewees talked about the difference in their own private relationships, intimate relationships regarding Europe. In Europe, we consider that Portugal is still a relatively conservative country in the habits and customs, because we had a Catholic background, which was very strict. But for my Nepalese interviewees, they consider that, for example, Portuguese women are a bit more liberated than Nepalese women. Like, they work very often outside the house, they can get divorced, they can get their own, sometimes they are single with no children until their 40s, which is not common in Nepal. They don't move to the house of the father-in-law and the mother-in-law as it is common in Nepal. So one different thing is in intimate relationships, and family life is quite different. Another thing is, okay, the religion. The Portuguese, if you talk with them, like 80% are going to say, I'm non-practicing Catholic, which means their father, grandfather, they were practicing Catholics. Nowadays we have more agnostics, atheists, or people who say they are Catholic because the family was, but they don't go to church, they don't practice. And the Nepalese have very different. They have Buddhist and Hindu backgrounds, and they have also the traditional animist religions of different ethnic groups. So that's another religion is another
So
difference.
have you found anything difficulties to their daily lifestyles due to the difference between the belief system and the religious?
In the daily life, food, for example, Portuguese eat very often pork, and for many Nepalese this is not advisable. One problem that we had here in the health centers when we went to talk with the doctors who have more Nepalese patients and also Bangladeshi in this case, they reported many psychosomatic illnesses among Nepalese patients, young boys coming here. Why? Because they associated it with the stress regarding the legalization process, with being immersed in a culture where they cannot speak Portuguese with the locals, and also with eating too much pork, which is forbidden, kind of forbidden food for some groups.
That means some of the Nepalese peoples are suffering from the stress and the depression due to the differentiations of the cultural.
If you go to talk with these people here in Anjos Health Center or in Martim Muniz Health Center, there's a big health center also there. The doctors put these questions constantly about psychosomatic disorders coming from stress related.
That is from the depressions and
Stress and differences in culture also. Especially, you know that in Nepal you have some groups are vegetarian, some groups don't eat pork at all, and they could find like many. We were faced with, there is this syndrome, psychosomatic syndrome, which is described in some medical literature, especially in South Asia, in Asia in general, that they call Koro syndrome. Many times, many young boys show up in the health center with complaints about sexual kind of complaints. And they don't know why that is, because nothing is wrong with them. And it's a psychosomatic illness due to stress, due to different culture. Also, they don't have relationships here with Portuguese ladies, and the Nepalese girls coming here, they are like 1/3 of Nepalese. So many men, very few women come.
They are suffering from the sexual management.
Yeah, and also they believe sometimes that eating pork is bad for them or for their sexual. It's traditional, especially the boys who come from rural areas. They don't like the Portuguese food so much because we eat too much pork, and for them it's not so.
Even the beef is the very restrictions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll talk about the economic conditions of the Nepalese people here in response, even in the Portugal.
Economically, a small percentage of the Nepalese, they got to be very successful business owners in Lisbon and outside Lisbon. They have multiple businesses. They are usually from important families or families related with the consul or with political families, or the families who have been living, the pioneers who came like 20 years ago to Portugal. So very few have very important businesses in hotels, restaurants, buying and selling houses, supermarkets, and so on. But then the large majority of the people who come, they work many hours in low-paid, low-income jobs. Many times they are exploited, either by Portuguese bosses, by Chinese bosses in the Chinese restaurants and sushi restaurants. Many workers are Nepalese here in Lisbon, or by Nepalese themselves. So they come with certain promises of easy legalization, a very good income, and a good life in Europe, and then they are faced with very hard conditions. They get accommodation usually through their own networks of family and friends and contacts. Not officially, they share a house with many people, that's common. But it's also a Nepalese culture to share, but the Portuguese authorities don't worry themselves too much about the accommodation of people coming here. So economically, it's hard. It's still one of the easiest countries in Europe to get the residence card after some 9 months, 2 years sometimes. But in other countries it's harder, so that's why people come. And usually they have the expectation of going somewhere else in Europe, to the UK, to Belgium, to Denmark, or they have family there. So when they get the residence card, they try to move to North Europe because they think that, and it's true, the social system there is better. You get more support for the kids, for the education of the kids. If they get education in English, that it's better. And many Nepalese parents tell me that they would prefer their kids to be in university, for example, in the UK or somewhere else. And normally they have family already in Europe that helps them to move. So I think the community is still struggling in many issues economically, and they are very often exploited either in agriculture jobs or in factories. We have some cases of factories in Sintra, Leiria, furniture factories also, and the red berry farms where they get jobs. But sometimes I got some cases in the south, like people came paying 12,000 euros from the countryside of Nepal directly, and they were in an isolated farm. They did not get their salary for 3 or 4 months. So they lived inside the farm, worked inside the farm, and had no money to go out of the farm. We were helping, there were 22 Nepalese in that farm in the south of Portugal last year. So now they have their residence permits, but we had to denounce the case to the CNAI, to the Portuguese staff, and then they sent someone to inspect the farm, and then it took a while. So very often low-paid jobs, they come highly indebted because they ask loans to come to Europe, to their family and to their friends, or to some agents with high interest rates. In Nepal, you can get informal loans, and with 15% interest rate or 18% crazy interest rates. I got some people here also in Lisbon who, in that case, they were Sherpas, and they borrowed money from other Sherpas with very high interest rates, and they were highly indebted. They had to close their businesses. There are a few cases of people who came, invested thousands of euros in their business, and then later on they had to go back to Nepal and had high debts to their employees here, other Nepalese, and also to rent the shops. They had to pay a very high rent. In central Lisbon, the rents are getting high.
So that means Nepalese who wants to come here and for the agriculture workers, they have to pay big amounts to come here per agency or per agents, and then the earning level is not such
And sometimes they don't know what is their final destination in Europe, because sometimes these agents hire them to come to Poland to work, for example, in a chicken farm in Poland for 6 months, for example. They don't get paid, or they get paid like 100 something, 200 euros per month. Very long hours of work every day, just 1 day off. And then finally, when the permit in Europe, in Poland expires, which is like a 6-month period, they tell them, oh, you have to move somewhere else in Europe, and they bring them by car or by bus they tell them, Portugal is a place where you can get the residence permit now, and they bring them. So when their visa in Poland expired already, so they get here already in a undocumented situation, so very fragile, so easily exploited by other people who promise them, I'll give you a job, and after 3 months you get your residence permit. And many times that doesn't happen. They don't pay, and they don't get the residence permit just after 3 months. They have to wait longer. Also, these visas, we found out that the Portuguese embassy in India was involved in that. They had some employees who were involved with agencies, and they charge much more for the Portuguese visa than they should. They should charge 125 euros, and they charge like 9,000 euros or 10,000 to come to Europe. So, and that way people can come. But we had cases of several companies, Portuguese companies, trying to hire directly in Nepal, doing interviews to many people via Skype, contacting our embassy in New Delhi. And by the end of the process, they had selected all the workers. The embassy didn't give the visas to the company. So when they try to hire legally, they cannot, even after selecting all the workers. But when the agents bring them and paying that kind of amount of money for years sometimes, because people pay a little bit every month to the people who brought them, to the traffickers, then in that case they get the visa. So it's unexplainable, and we were trying to do bilateral agreements between the Foreign Office of Nepal and the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Portugal to get a more transparent process. Okay, we need labor. Of course, we need foreign labor because Portugal is we have too many elders. It's like the third country in Europe with more elders. And we need immigrants, we need workforce, but these people are contributing to the social security, to the tax office, and sometimes they are waiting for 2 years just for a residence permit because the SAF says that they don't have enough staff to issue the permits more earlier than that. And at the same time, it benefits these agriculture companies and factory companies that are exploiting this low-wage workforce.
Okay,
So,
that means the Nepalese workers come here from the different routes of the European neighbor countries. You know about the Nepalese governments, they have they have authority to Portugal as destinations for the foreign laborers.
they don't have. They have a consulate here. So the consulate here is under the embassy of Paris. There are 2 or 3 countries. Yeah. But we don't have like the NRNA representatives here in Lisbon. They have more easy access to the NRNA cupola, the president, and so on. He visited Portugal. The Minister of Agriculture of Nepal last year also visited these areas in Portugal, where the most workers are in the farms. So that has been it, but not official contacts at the both governments level. You see, the Nepalese government has an interest. They know about these conditions of the workers, but also there are some agents also involved with politics in Nepal. So it's not transparent. Also, the relationships between these agents and some Nepalese officials. But the Nepalese officials, they showed an interest in doing it more legally, like a bilateral agreement like they had with Israel, with South Korea, with Japan, for the Nepalese to have all their rights assured in the destination country. So it's from the Portuguese side that this process is more stuck at the moment. And now we have elections in October, so we have a new government since November. We have this new Secretary of State of Migrations that I know personally because I worked with her. And I don't know what they're going to try to do. They are open to South Asian immigration because they have been dealing. There are several researchers of South Asian immigrants now in the government. Also, there are good relationships with our government because
You means there is no mutual
mutual agreement yet.
But the Nepal government website is listed 110 secure destinations, all authorized destinations for the foreign labor.
And Portugal is one of them?
Portugal is 108 or something. So,
Okay.
it's down there. I'm not sure about the formally, but in the website they have already
It's listed as safe.
Yes, authorized destinations for the foreign labor. Okay, now I will ask about the. Have you ever found just being a Nepalese laborers and there is something like low payments or something discriminations in the working
Discrimination, yes.
Mhm.
In my interviews, most of the workers that I interviewed in the businesses of Lisbon and also in the south, in the farms even more, they talked very often about discrimination by the Portuguese and also sometimes even by bosses, for example, of another ethnic group or caste from higher level in the caste system from Nepalese origin. Okay? But very often about discrimination of Portuguese because they told me many times, you know, Asians here in Europe, they are nothing, or we don't speak the language they consider as low citizens, or they don't understand about our culture, they think that we are, I don't know, different from Europeans. This was constant.
They are not perfect human, like
They are?
They are treating like they are not perfect humans, and
Yes, many times this kind of complaints.
Europeans, the Portuguese are the superior than the Asian people.
Yes, many times this kind of complaints. I had a few minority that told me, for example, a lady who works here in a hairdresser, but she has already a good position in the company. And she told me, oh, okay, my colleagues, they all help me very much. And she has just Portuguese colleagues. But it was an exception because most of them complain about discrimination in access to work, access to education also, because many times they try to keep going in their studies, in their BAs, MAs, PhDs. They were trying to apply in Lisbon, and some colleges in Lisbon, they don't even have classes in English for them, or education. Okay, we have cases of second and third generation already born here, who are very good students and already in the university level in Portugal, Nepalese descendants.
The child born here in Portugal.
Yeah.
And this is the another matter. And the child who migrate from the Nepal, who they are already in the school age.
That's an issue also with adaptation because the school teachers, primary school and secondary school, they cannot communicate with the parents nor the parents with the family. So we lack, as I told you before when we were not recording, we lack these cultural mediators that are common in other European countries, in schools, in health centers, in hospitals, because most of the maternities in Lisbon have 300 something children from Nepal being born every year.
Yeah, this is your out of your research area, but I just want to get
in
some
education.
idea. I just want to get some idea about is the Nepalese children migrate from the Nepal, who they are age of school age, and they are facing something like you told what the psychological problems due to the language and the circle, friend circles.
Usually the teachers complain that the children are too passive or not stimulated enough. I suppose it has to do with different cultures also, because the teachers talk about like this constant stimulation at home with homework, with constant tasks, and that's not what happens in Nepalese families. The children are more social. Sometimes they are engaged in social festivities.
In the school children who migrate from the Nepal,
sometimes they face
silence, I think.
Silent, more quiet, more obeying of authority than the Portuguese ones, who have more behavior problems at school. Also, the language is also an issue, but although when they are young school children, with their peers, they can learn the language pretty fast, and sometimes they even help the parents later on with Portuguese.
So we have to research about the psychological situations of the migrants.
Also.
We hope so. We will develop the research.
For me, intercultural psychology is very interesting for me also, because sometimes it's just a cultural affair, and people face it as handicap of the children, for example. Also, the parenting styles. We had several Nepalese students here studying the parenting styles, because in Europe they are more the family structure is not so rigid, and maybe the parenting styles are more flexible. And the respect of tradition is not so important, or families are more chaotic, there are many divorced parents. So parenting style, they studied this, and they studied that also the Nepalese parents, when they come to Portugal, they start to adapt their parenting styles to the local culture. So it's half Nepali culture and half Portuguese. They get a bit more flexible, they get other expectations for their children different from when they were in Nepal. Also, there is this thing with the school children, the girls and the boys. In Nepal, there is a different education, very different for the boys and for the girls. In Portugal, this is mixed at school. So they have mixed classes, and the expectations are more or less the same for the girls and the boys. They are educated the same, with not so rigid gender roles, maybe.
I think it will be the barrier for, or the difficult for their psychological developments also, because they are not perfect in the Portuguese cultures, and they are not perfect in the Nepalese cultures.
Second generations are a bit halfway between.
Halfway. Okay, so we'll talk about one thing I want to remind you. Your dissertations is Nepalese entrepreneurs here in response. So, what is the rate of contributions of Nepalese entrepreneurs in the Portuguese national economy?
Well, in Lisbon, that rate is even higher. For example, in Lisbon, in the city center, we figure that they contribute a very high percentage of the GDP. We don't know for sure, because many businesses open and close, each year, but it's a very high percentage. And among the immigrant communities that we have, it's one of the most entrepreneurial. So I compared in my thesis with the Bangladeshis, with the Chinese, and the Nepalese are especially active in creating their own businesses and creating jobs for the other Nepalese coming. So we had many declining businesses in the city center in 2008, 2009, and nowadays it's flourishing. We have a larger amount of businesses, we have more offer of different kinds of services, travel agencies to Nepal, we have these shops of electronics, we have the restaurants, we have hostels, we have hotels run also by Nepalese, so I found out very large amount, very different kinds of businesses, although the high majority is restaurants and hotels or housing. But the range is very diverse. New combination, one innovation that the Nepalese entrepreneurs bring is that many times they combine different services in one company, or they offer just one entrepreneur. He offers different complementary services, or a new combination that our entrepreneurs did not have that kind of habit.
That is like an innovation.
Yes, for example, you get a guy who has, for example, a supermarket, more common thing, a supermarket chain. But then he also has, at the same time, has an export business, exporting Portuguese wine for Nepal. And at the same time, he has a travel agency shop nearby with other different partners doing travels, and has a touristic guides in South Asia for Nepalese going there, and also for Portuguese who want to do tourism in South Asia. So it's this kind of just one entrepreneur can combine 2 or 3 areas of
different kind
yes,
of business.
and that's it's a way to thrive and to survive, but it's also the level of innovation. It's very interesting in these businesses. Also, we know that many times people create a business because they come here, and the easiest way to get a tax office number and a social security number is by creating your own business. Sometimes with family from the UK or Belgium helping them to rent a place. But also it's a way to have their co-nationals and many times co-ethnic from the same ethnic group employed when they arrive. So they create the business, they give the accommodation, and they have the job already waiting for you when you come. But it creates a kind of, sometimes it's too closed. So sometimes the interaction with the Portuguese society is limited because you are going around the circles. Many people told me, oh, in the Almirante Reis area, you go around and you just listen Nepalese on the street. Is that I was in Nepal, so I don't need to learn the Portuguese because I can interact with other Nepalese. I can speak English with other foreigners, and I don't need to get more adapted in the society because I have this kind of network that works for me.
Okay, here I want to know about the.
So in the city center, about 30% of the businesses, local businesses, have interference or have business partners who are of Nepalese origin. So it's a very high rate, and the percentage of the GDP in the center, it's a very high contribution. Although we don't have exactly one quantification, but we know that in about 30% of the businesses there are some Nepalese involved directly or indirectly. And also there are more than 30 informal groups of Nepalese already created in Lisbon, some political, some cultural, some related with Nepalese women, children, youth. So those are also quantified. Yeah,
okay. Here I want to know about how the Portuguese national economy perceives to Nepalese peoples and the Nepalese economy here in Portugal. Because you are Portuguese, so you have access in the national level of the economic discourse, the policy, and your subject is
yes.
Nepali entrepreneurs.
They are perceived as, for a long time, a bit like as if they were a hidden community, because it's a very big community already, but for a long time they were hidden in a way that, okay, Portuguese would speak about Nepalese as if they were very hardworking immigrants, very not creating any problems like other communities of immigrants, very quiet, very festive, because they know about all the Nepalese festivals that go out around the year that happen in the city. But nowadays they are becoming more visible in the Portuguese society and also in the economy also, because there are famous cases of success. For example, I will tell you about this. There's a Nepalese chef who has several Italian restaurants and pizzerias in Lisbon. He was living in Italy for several years, came here, and now he runs up-level restaurants in Lisbon where all the politicians go. And he's always presented as this success case of of the Nepalese in Lisbon. Also some hotel owners and managers, and even some of these agriculture farm.
I think the individual success and some communal success is the matter we already talked about. But here I want to know
if it's becoming more visible.
Yeah, is the national level economics Portugal's. Nepalese economy is visible. It's a part of economy of national economics of Portugal, or it's still a hidden economy.
I think it's becoming more visible. You know, lately, the last year or so, we were also doing an effort to make it visible. So now the government is talking about the high contribution of the immigrants to the taxes, tax office every year, to the social security, record numbers of contribution of these immigrants to our social security system. So because also many researchers were doing pressure for that to happen, you know.
That means we can hope if the further economic policies or the economic policies will be the look after the Nepalese economic contributions also.
We have suggestions even for the Portuguese banks, you know, to implement much more measures to support the entrepreneurs from Nepal and from other countries, like they have in the UK, special programs for, or other countries like Denmark, Finland, for immigrant entrepreneurs to start their own businesses, to give them courses, to give them loans, official loans, etc. 45 minutes.
No, I'm looking for the.
The lady should be calling. But just to finish, we were doing conferences in Lisbon. We were doing workshops. We were trying to make pressure for the politicians to recognize this contribution, because we have such a high amount of old population who depends of the pensions of the social security, and who is paying those pensions? The active population and the Nepalese and the immigrants. So, especially in Lisbon, it's becoming much more visible. They are doing journalistic special reports about it since 1 year and a half until now. They are doing special reports on TV also, trying to understand a little bit more of the culture and of the different groups. So it's changing slowly, but it's changing.
So Nepalese economy is visible as a part of the national economy. Okay. So,
and especially in Lisbon, because Lisbon is trying to sell this image of multiculturality nowadays for tourists. And the Nepalese are part of that, and it's part of also our marketing strategy in touristic terms of our government.
Okay, we are already going very long, so at last we will go the very short political situations of the Nepalese peoples here in the Portugal.
So I think
like politics with intra-community of Nepalese between Nepalese, or the gender men and women, or the national politics, or the like the Nepalese politics parties, branches, or something. What you have as
there are Nepalese branches here of almost all the Nepalese political parties. So the Marxist, Leninists, the Communists, the party, the Congress party, no, Congress Nepali party. So almost all of them have representation here. Those people usually are involved also with the direction of NRNA here, at least in Europe usually. And there are disputes among different political groups. On the other hand, there's a slice of the community who doesn't want to have anything to do with politics of Nepal, especially. They say, oh, now we are here, we don't want to have anything to do with that, it's a big mess, the politics in our country.
Some of them keep aside from the politics.
Yes, they try to avoid totally. There are very good connections with some Portuguese political parties. The leaders of Nepalese associations, not only the NRNA, all of the other groups, are usually involved with the Lisbon Town Hall and the Lisbon Mayor, with the PS, the Portuguese Government Party. They have very strong connection. Why? Because our Prime Minister is half Portuguese, he's and half Indian. He's the son of an Indian journalist who came here. And he tries to keep good relationships with South Asia. And some Nepalese were lobbying here. They become members of his political party.
Oh.
They have very good relationships, high-level relationships with ministers and with the prime minister. So this is what I can tell you. And with BE, before we had a coalition in government with the left bloc BE, and with the BE they also had very good connection because they were in government. Now they are not in government. So especially with the government party, there are members of the government party. There are Nepalese who became members of the opposition party, PSD, also.
Okay, one thing I want to know here is if the Nepalese origin peoples, when they will get Portuguese nationality here, then can he will be the political mainstream?
If they can apply for political jobs,
even prime positions of the political.
you have to. That's another policy that we should change because it's still very conservative. You have to live here for, I think, to apply for a political position. You have to live here for at least 5-6 years and have a passport. Apply for the passport.
That is
So that's a big issue because we have thousands and thousands of immigrants who are active in the society and they don't have exactly a political voice in the sense of being able to be representatives in the parliament and have political positions. So that's another thing that we are doing pressure to change.
Okay. One thing, if one of the Nepalese or the immigrant peoples, they get the Portuguese permanent residence, then he can achieve the prime positions of the politics, like the prime
No,
ministers.
just with the nationality, just with the passport.
They don't have to rights to go the parliament.
Yeah, that's one problem. That's a big problem.
There is still
This gap in the legal rights, at least in the political representation. Not only with the Nepalese, also with before South Asians, we had a big wave of immigration from Portuguese-speaking countries, Brazil and African countries that speak Portuguese. And all these people have been fighting for a long, long time to get access to the political representation in parliament and in the ministries. And usually they have to have also the nationality. Only now, in these elections, we got elected the first black women, for example, 2 of them, for the parliament. So it's going very slowly. But we are trying to change the law for people after 2-3 years and contributing here.
It's being something.
Yeah, to be able to be politicians here also, and not have to have the nationality.
Okay, at last I want to some voices. Like, do you have something? Have you found something like a conflict between the Nepalese and the Nepalese, or the Nepalese and Portuguese? Or at last, I want to how Portuguese local people perceive to Nepali peoples, Nepali immigrants. These are the combined
conflicts I found more than between Portuguese and Nepalese, or Nepalese among themselves. I found more between Nepalese and sometimes other immigrant communities like Bangladeshis or Indians or Sikhs. In some areas, even in these agriculture areas, they join everyone together with very different cultures, very different habits, like 20 men living in a container, small container, from different areas of Nepal and ethnic groups from different areas of Pakistan, of Bangladesh, of India, and they have very different habits, and sometimes this creates conflicts. But sometimes, in that case, it has to do with accommodation, or some fights. For example, the Sikhs use a knife. In the south, I found some communities where Nepalese boys were stabbed by Sikhs. They had a fight and they were stabbed in the middle of the street in a small village.
It was dispute between the Nepalese and Nepalese?
No, Nepalese and Indian, Punjabis. In the case of Nepalese, the most common fights that I found was when you have these special programs or festivals. Usually the youth goes, or even DJs that come from other places in Europe for these programs. Later in the night, you know that people here drink much more than in Nepal, because especially the boys. young boys like 20 something, they go to these programs, and late in the night at 2 or 3 a.m. they are all drunk, and sometimes there are fights among each other, but it's usually a teenager thing that even the older ones don't like it too much, and they know it's related sometimes with, I found also the doctors talk about this also, many alcohol problems when the young boys come and they are unemployed. Here sometimes they spend a lot of time in the cafe drinking the whole day, so that's also an issue.
Have you ever found like a big fighting, like a murder,
There are a couple cases. In the south, for example, in a beach in the south, in Alentejo, in Zambujeira, one Nepali was found dead at the beach. He was disappearing, a worker of agriculture, and he was found dead like some weeks after. Nobody knows who did it, if it was the boss, the Portuguese boss, if it was colleagues, if it was people that he borrowed money from. So the most like serious cases, we don't know for sure who did it. Like couple of people disappeared or even murdered, and also there are some couple cases of suicides also. But this has to do this stress that I told you about regarding the legalization process. Sometimes people are in very hard situations and they cannot adapt to the culture, and sometimes there are a couple cases like that also.
Okay,
And
Dr. Alexandra, you are yourself Portuguese, and you have, of course, you have good relations with the Portuguese and local peoples. How local Portuguese people perceives to Nepali immigrants?
they perceive them as hardworking, friendly,
Really?
compared with other.
Okay.
This is the official. Okay, when another Portuguese talks with them about this is what they say. I don't mean that if they deal directly with you or another Nepalese, they don't discriminate you at the job or. But this is the official idea: hardworking and friendly, comparing with other communities living here, and also very festive, because they said Nepalese have parties every weekend, every weekend. And they perceive as okay. Now, as I told you, nowadays, okay, has the Asians, a slice of the Portuguese are still racist regarding Asians, and all throughout Europe, the Portuguese are considered like friendly in general, but I know that in indirect ways, sometimes if you have a Nepalese applying for a job and a Portuguese or a Brazilian, maybe they prefer someone who speaks good Portuguese, and they try to, even if you are more qualified to the job, you know. And nowadays they are becoming more familiar with this idea that the Nepalese they journalists and other people talk about them as being exploited in Portugal. So easy labor and cheap labor. And a slice of the people are also talking about this contribution that they give to our pension system and social security system, which is becoming higher every year. They also talk about the way how they say that the parents are not very active disciplining the children compared with the Portuguese, that the children are not very stimulated. I don't know what that means, but this is common even in the hospital staff, the nurses and so on. They say this. So sometimes the face has in the children, just like a side note, in the children the face has a development handicap, something that is very common in Nepal or in the Nepalese culture, because there are these cultural issues that they are not aware about. Also, they say about the diet. In the medical staff, this is very common, that the diet is high in cholesterol. They don't know that South Asians usually have higher cholesterol than Europeans. So it's a difference, and diabetes cases. And they say that it's because of poor diet. And it's not, it's just different diet.
It is not balanced diet.
Sometimes, but sometimes it's like a more genetic thing, you know. In South Asia, diabetes is much more common.
Okay, Dr. Alexdra, it's a very good time, it's around 1 hour, and thank you very much. So, at last, do you want to say something to my
Recommendations.
viewers and me? That's recommendations. So just if you have some words at last.
Well, the words that I have is that Nepalese are very welcome in Portugal, at least from my viewpoint. They are very welcome. They are a very peaceful, compared with other community. They are contributing a lot to the Portuguese economy, and we need this kind of entrepreneurship, innovation that they bring. Also more open-minded in some cases than the Portuguese in some areas. Very well connected in Europe, something that our Portuguese businessmen traditionally weren't. And also that try to be, for newcomers, try to be a bit careful about the people that you contact for as intermediaries to come here. Sometimes they charge you too much money and not in legal ways, or they try to cheat you coming here. Also, if you need any assistance, try to contact the Nepalese associations at first, and then Portuguese ones like NAI. But closer to the community is the Nepalese associations are much more aware of the problems. And they are doing pressure to get people legalized and with residence permits much faster than they are nowadays. So you are very welcome. Thank you very much for your contribution.